There is a betrayal going on. How crude and rude and disgusting this man is. No wonder Meghan Markle wants nothing to do with him these days.
Shit shower shave, obviously. Normally once you're 40 or older, never trust a fart. But you're young and you, on the M25, shat your pants via a fart. That's hilarious.
There's really been a lot about the negativity in this marriage which is coming through across the course of this visit too.
What is the point of marrying a Prince of England if you're not going to get FaceTime with the head royal in the palace?
For years, Prince Harry, the Duke of Sussex, and Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, had demanded protection for private family moments. Yet almost as soon as reports of a discreet United Kingdom reunion surfaced, selected details appeared to follow. The question was no longer whether a meeting happened, but who wanted the world to know and why. According to reports, the Sussexes returned to Britain under conditions that appeared controlled. There was said to be no official photograph, no public balcony moment, no palace announcement celebrating a reconciliation, and no carefully staged image designed for front pages around the world. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed the arrangements, and many details remain unverified. On the surface, that restraint suggested a family encounter rather than a constitutional event. But the silence did not last in the way royal silence usually does. Soon, descriptions of the atmosphere, the setting, the people believed to have been present, and even the supposed emotional meaning of the visit began entering public discussion. None of these fragments alone prove that Prince Harry or Meghan had personally disclosed anything. Information surrounding the royal family can emerge through staff.
To say this man is a disgrace to the British royal family, to say this man is so diminished that he would now leave his late grandmother, Queen Elizabeth II, rolling in her grave. To say this man is crude and rude and a bully and a homophobe and all of those things that he has proclaimed he is not over the past few years is also an understatement.
Friends, commentators, or media speculation. Yet the speed and shape of the reporting created an uncomfortable impression. A meeting presented as private was already becoming a public narrative. That distinction matters. For King Charles III, the reunion was reportedly framed as something deeply personal, involving a father, a son, a daughter-in-law, and grandchildren separated by distance and years of conflict. If those reports are accurate, Charles may have viewed the moment through the emotional instincts of a parent rather than the defensive calculations of a monarch. But royal families do not experience private events in the same way ordinary families do. A quiet conversation can become a diplomatic signal. A closed door can suggest forgiveness. A brief visit can alter public perceptions of loyalty, status, and access. And that may be why the emerging details cause such unease. The Sussexes did not need an official palace photograph to benefit from renewed royal proximity. The simple suggestion that Meghan had again entered the king's private world was enough to generate headlines, revive global interest, and remind audiences that her public identity remains connected to the institution she and Harry have repeatedly criticized. Was the reunion primarily about healing, or had its symbolic value already become too powerful to remain private?
Asked about his grooming routine, he decides to talk about something he describes as shit, shower, and shave, leading to a truly repulsive conversation about his pubic hair that is completely unbecoming.
What's your grooming routine with your auburn?
Just shit shower shave, obviously.
Shit shower and a shave?
Yes.
So you answer it.
How did you get rid of it?
Queen Camilla was also reported to have been present, although the precise nature of her involvement has not been officially confirmed. If true, her presence would carry considerable meaning. Harry criticized the Queen in his memoir and accused her of participating in a media system that harmed others to protect her own standing. A meeting that included Camilla would therefore represent more than a simple family tea. It would place the Duke of Sussex in the same room as a woman he had publicly blamed, under the roof and authority of the father whose institution he has repeatedly challenged. For some observers, that would indicate Harry accepting the realities of the royal hierarchy. For others, it would suggest that Charles was willing to reopen the door without first securing a public apology or meaningful retraction. The same event could therefore be interpreted as royal strength or royal surrender. But once details began appearing outside that room, another question became unavoidable. Had the king offered privacy to people who still understood private access as a form of public currency? Prince William, the Prince of Wales, sits at the center of that concern even without making any public statement. Reports and commentary have repeatedly suggested that William remains deeply cautious about renewed contact with his younger brother. Kensington Palace has not confirmed claims that he considered the reunion a betrayal, and those descriptions should remain attributed rather than treated as fact. Even so, the future king's possible anxiety is not difficult to understand.
The real Prince Harry is nothing like the woke Prince Harry that he's tried to present himself as.
Private family experiences have previously appeared in interviews, documentaries, podcasts, and Prince Harry's memoir. William has already seen personal memories transformed into global content. From Charles's perspective, refusing contact forever may seem cruel, especially where grandchildren are involved. From William's perspective, granting access without clear boundaries may appear dangerous. A father can hope that affection will change behavior. An heir must consider what happens if that hope fails, and if even small details from this reunion are being shaped into headlines. Was William's caution excessive, or was it based on a pattern the king was emotionally unwilling to confront? The language surrounding the reunion is itself revealing. Reports did not merely state that family members met. They began attaching meaning to the encounter: a thaw, a turning point, a humiliation, a victory, a submission, or a calculated return. Each description favored a different side. A family visit protected Charles from appearing politically weak. A royal reunion restored status to the Sussexes. A private meeting suggested intimacy, while leaked descriptions made that intimacy marketable. This is where the story becomes more complicated than a disagreement about confidentiality.
Asked Harry's occupation, and it became clear that the only thing he still leans on is being a royal.
Meghan and Harry have built much of their post-royal identity around controlling their own narrative. They have argued that palace systems, hostile newspapers, and anonymous briefings distorted their lives. Yet controlling a narrative often requires releasing selected information while withholding the parts that might weaken it. If details are emerging now, the crucial issue is not only whether they are accurate, but which image they are designed to create. Did the Sussexes return as relatives seeking peace, or as public figures needing renewed connection to the crown? Did Charles establish strict conditions, or did emotion persuade him to overlook the risks? And why did a supposedly private moment begin generating such specific interpretations before the palace had offered the public anything at all? Those questions were only the first warning. Because beneath the headlines about reunion and forgiveness was a more sensitive struggle over who would define what happened inside that room and what the public would be encouraged to believe next. And that struggle over definition may prove more consequential than the meeting itself, because in royal life, the first version of an event often becomes the version the public remembers. Once a private encounter is described as warm, emotional, significant, or historic, the absence of photographs and official statements can actually make the narrative more powerful. The public is left imagining what happened, while unnamed sources and interested observers compete to fill the silence. This is where the timing of each detail becomes important. Information does not need to arrive in one dramatic disclosure to influence opinion. It can emerge gradually: a suggestion that the atmosphere was cordial, a claim that family members spent meaningful time together, an implication that old tensions softened, or a carefully placed description of who appeared comfortable and who remained distant. Each fragment may appear harmless, but together they can construct an emotional storyline before the palace has decided whether it wants any storyline at all. Royal commentators have noted that modern reputation management often works through accumulation rather than announcement. One sympathetic detail creates warmth. Another implies acceptance. A third suggests that reconciliation is already progressing behind closed doors. By the time official sources refuse to comment, the public may interpret that silence not as uncertainty, but as quiet confirmation. Was the reunion being reported, or was it being shaped into something larger than the evidence could support? For the king, this creates a delicate problem. Charles may have wanted to separate his role as a father from his responsibilities as sovereign, yet those identities cannot be fully divided. Any private welcome from the monarch carries institutional weight, especially when it involves relatives who stepped away from royal duties and later challenged the system publicly. Even if the meeting contained no discussion of official roles, public funding, security, titles, or future appearances, the symbolism of access alone could be interpreted as a form of rehabilitation. That interpretation would affect more than Charles. Senior royal staff would have to consider whether renewed contact could generate expectations the institution had no intention of meeting. Would audiences begin anticipating another visit, a public appearance, or a formal family photograph? Would media organizations treat the reunion as evidence that the Sussexes were slowly returning to the royal fold? And if no further invitation followed, would the palace then be accused of cruelty after allowing hope to build? These are not merely public relations questions. They concern the monarchy's ability to establish boundaries without creating fresh conflict. A private meeting may appear compassionate, but compassion can become strategically complicated when every gesture is examined for constitutional meaning. The king may believe that seeing his family requires no political explanation. The institution around him, however, must prepare for the possibility that others will attach one. The children are also drawn into this tension, even though they are not responsible for any of it. Prince Archie and Princess Lilibet remain powerful symbols within the wider family story because their relationship with the king has been discussed through distance, security concerns, and missed opportunities. Reports about a reunion involving them naturally produce emotional interest. Yet the more their private contact becomes part of a public narrative, the harder it becomes to argue that these moments belong entirely outside the media arena. That raises a difficult question for both parents. If Harry and Meghan want their children protected from royal scrutiny, how much detail should ever be allowed to circulate about their contact with the monarch? Describing affection may humanize the reunion, but it also invites further attention. Suggesting that Charles was moved may encourage sympathy, but it turns a grandfather's private reaction into public material. Even positive information can cross a boundary when the people involved have not agreed to share it. Some observers believe this is precisely why the palace reportedly resisted an official photograph. A photograph would have offered undeniable evidence of closeness and could have been reproduced indefinitely across documentaries, advertisements, social media posts, and future promotional campaigns. Without one, the institution retained a degree of control. But the absence of an image also increased the value of verbal descriptions, because every account became a substitute for the picture the public was denied. The result is an unusual contest between visibility and credibility. The Sussexes may benefit from being associated with the king, but if too many favorable details appear too quickly, suspicion grows over where they originated. The palace may benefit from appearing compassionate, yet if it challenges the reporting too aggressively, it risks making a family visit look like a political crisis. Both sides, therefore, have reasons to speak carefully and equally strong reasons to let others speak for them. This is where royal correspondents, friends, former staff members, commentators, and unnamed sources enter the story. Each may possess different levels of knowledge, and some may simply be interpreting public clues. A report can begin with one genuine fact and collect speculation as it travels. By the time it reaches television panels and social media channels, assumptions can sound like eyewitness testimony. That does not prove an organized leak, but it demonstrates how quickly a private event can escape the control of everyone involved. The more sensitive issue is whether selective accounts could influence future negotiations. If the reunion is widely portrayed as successful, pressure may build on Charles to continue the process. If it is described as a victory for Harry and Meghan, William's caution may appear increasingly isolated. If it is framed as the Sussexes accepting the king's conditions, the palace can argue that royal authority remained intact. The battle is therefore not only over what happened, but over which side appears to have conceded more. For the Prince of Wales, this may be the point at which personal distrust becomes institutional concern. William does not need to oppose reconciliation in principle to question the way it is managed. His future reign will inherit any precedent created now. If private access is followed by favorable publicity, he may conclude that every meeting carries an unavoidable communications risk. If the details remain limited and accurate, Charles may believe trust can slowly be rebuilt. Their disagreement, if one exists, would therefore concern method as much as emotion. Yet another possibility was beginning to trouble palace observers. What if the details appearing publicly were only the safest fragments, the warm descriptions, symbolic gestures, and carefully chosen impressions, while more sensitive claims were being reserved for later. Because once a private reunion becomes a story, the next source, interview, memoir, or documentary does not have to reveal everything at once. It only has to promise that there is more still waiting beneath the surface. That possibility changes the meaning of every carefully chosen detail, because the royal household has seen this pattern before. A private experience does not always become public in one explosive moment. It can be released in stages, each account appearing limited, until the accumulation forms a version of events that is difficult to challenge without revealing even more. The institution learned that lesson during the years following the Sussexes' departure from royal duties. Personal disagreements that once belonged to family conversations later appeared across interviews, documentaries, speeches, and Prince Harry's memoir. Each disclosure arrived with its own justification, correcting the record, explaining emotional harm, defending Meghan, or exposing a system they believed had failed them. Yet from the palace perspective, the effect was cumulative. Trust was damaged by the growing belief that nothing said in confidence could be guaranteed to remain there. That history now hangs over any renewed contact with Charles. Even a conversation intended purely as a family exchange carries the memory of what followed earlier attempts at reconciliation. The king may believe circumstances have changed, particularly as time, illness, and separation place greater emotional weight on personal relationships. But institutions are slower to forgive than individuals because they are designed to remember risk. Courtiers do not assess only what people intend today, they examine what happened the last time similar access was granted. This may explain why observers have focused so closely on the conditions surrounding the reunion. No official image, no formal ceremonial setting, and no immediate palace statement could suggest an effort to limit what the encounter might later be used to prove. If that interpretation is correct, the monarchy was reducing the number of symbols that could be presented as evidence of restoration, endorsement, or a future royal role. Yet the strategy contained an obvious weakness. Physical evidence can be controlled more easily than emotional description. A photograph requires permission, access, and a camera. A claim that the meeting was warm, moving, or productive can travel through a single conversation and become repeated until its source is almost impossible to identify. The palace could prevent a family portrait, but not a portrait made entirely of words. This is why the balance of power may not be as simple as it appears. Charles controls access to royal residences and determines whether a meeting takes place. Harry and Meghan, however, possess something the monarchy cannot fully control, the ability to describe their own experience later, directly or indirectly, in language that reaches millions. The crown holds the door, but the Sussexes may hold the story. In the modern media landscape, which form of power is ultimately more valuable? For William, the answer may be uncomfortable. The Prince of Wales has spent years developing a disciplined public model built around carefully managed appearances, limited personal disclosure, and a firm separation between family life and institutional duty. His approach suggests that royal authority depends partly on preserving mystery. The more private conflict becomes entertainment, the less commanding the monarchy appears. If Harry's version of royal life continues to dominate international coverage, William may inherit not only the crown, but a contested narrative about what the family is and whom the public should trust. Catherine, Princess of Wales, is also affected by that contest, even when she remains silent. Earlier Sussex accounts drew her into deeply personal disputes, placing private tensions before a global audience and forcing the palace to respond through restraint rather than rebuttal. Any new cycle of selective disclosure could involve her by implication, particularly if the reunion is presented as evidence that some family members are willing to forgive while others remain resistant. Silence can then be transformed into coldness, even when it may simply reflect caution. The king's sister, princess, and represents another institutional instinct. The Princess Royal has long been associated with duty, continuity, and an unsentimental understanding of royal responsibility. There is no confirmed evidence that she shaped the reunion or its conditions, but commentators often invoke figures like, and when discussing the palace's traditional view, family affection may be private, but access to the monarchy must never become leverage. The commercial dimension cannot be ignored, although motive should not be assumed without evidence. Harry and Meghan remain public figures with media interests, charitable projects, and brands that benefit from attention. A renewed connection to the king naturally increases curiosity around everything they do next. The danger for the palace lies in appearance. Even an innocent family visit can be interpreted as royal validation once it appears beside product launches, interviews, or future programming. This creates a strategic problem for Charles. If he refuses contact, he risks being portrayed as a distant father and grandfather. If he allows contact, he risks giving the Sussexes renewed relevance. If he insists on silence, he may appear controlling. If he tolerates selective disclosures, he weakens the boundary he was trying to preserve. There may be no choice that protects both the family and the institution completely. But one further development threatened to make those calculations more serious. The concern was no longer limited to whether warm details had escaped. Palace observers were beginning to ask whether the reunion itself had created a new expectation, one that could force Charles toward another decision and place William in direct opposition to the path his father had chosen. That expectation may have been the real turning point, because once a single reunion is presented as the beginning of a wider thaw, the next encounter no longer appears optional. It begins to feel inevitable. Commentators start asking when Harry will return, whether Meghan will be welcomed again, whether the children will appear at a royal occasion, and whether the king is preparing to restore a relationship the institution had spent years keeping at a careful distance. Buckingham Palace has not publicly confirmed any program of future meetings, and there is no verified evidence that official duties, ceremonial appearances, or constitutional roles are being reconsidered. Yet public expectations do not always wait for palace confirmation. A narrative of reconciliation can gather momentum on its own, especially when every new report suggests that barriers are falling. The monarchy may then find itself responding not to what it promised, but to what the public has been encouraged to anticipate. That pressure would place Charles in an increasingly difficult position. If he allowed another private meeting, it could be interpreted as proof that the first reunion had succeeded. If he declined, the refusal might be framed as a sudden reversal or as evidence that other royals had intervened. Either decision could therefore become material for another cycle of accusation, speculation, and competing briefings. A moment intended to reduce conflict could instead create a new timetable of demands. The consequences for William would be particularly serious. The Prince of Wales is not simply another member of the family offering an opinion from the sidelines. He is the person expected to inherit the long-term effects of decisions made during his father's reign. Any informal understanding established now about access, communication, appearances, or the treatment of private information could become a precedent he is later pressured to continue. According to some royal commentators, this may explain why reports of William's discomfort have attracted such attention. Kensington Palace has not publicly verified claims that he opposed the reunion or viewed it as a betrayal. However, observers have argued that the future king's concern would be less about preventing a father from seeing his son and more about protecting the monarchy from a process it may no longer control. Was William resisting family peace or recognizing that reconciliation without enforceable boundaries could become an institutional liability? Public reaction began to expose that danger. Instead of the reunion producing a single image of dignity, it generated sharply divided interpretations. Some commentators praised Charles for acting as a father and grandfather. Others mocked the monarchy for appearing to reopen its doors after years of public criticism without receiving any visible apology. The king was described by critics as sentimental, vulnerable, and too easily persuaded, while the wider family was portrayed as trapped in a drama it could neither end nor publicly confront. Those reactions matter because monarchy depends heavily on the appearance of discipline. The crown can survive disagreement, but it struggles when private tensions make its authority look performative. If Harry and Meghan can criticize the institution, demand privacy, receive renewed access, and then benefit from a wave of favorable reporting, opponents may argue that palace boundaries carry little consequence. The issue is no longer whether reconciliation is compassionate. It is whether compassion is being interpreted as weakness. Queen Camilla's position would also become more exposed. Her reported presence may have been intended to ensure that Charles was not isolated and that the meeting reflected the realities of his current family. Yet the Queen has previously been a central target of Harry's criticism. If reports now portray the encounter as warm or successful without acknowledging that unresolved history, critics may claim the palace accepted a convenient public version while leaving deeper accusations unanswered. For Camilla, silence offers dignity but little defense. She cannot publicly explain what was said, correct emotional descriptions, or challenge claims about the atmosphere without violating the privacy the meeting was supposed to protect. The same applies to Catherine. Both women may be affected by narratives created around a reconciliation they did not publicly define. If they remain cautious, that restraint can be presented as hostility. If they participate, their presence can be used as evidence of complete royal acceptance. This is how a private family decision begins turning into public meaning. Each royal figure becomes assigned a role. Charles as the forgiving father, William as the resistant heir, Camilla as the watchful obstacle, Catherine as the silent holdout, Harry as the returning son, and Meghan as the figure regaining access to the center of royal prestige. These roles may be simplistic, but once repeated across headlines and commentary, they can shape perception more powerfully than the limited facts themselves. A historical pattern makes the situation even more sensitive. The modern monarchy has repeatedly struggled when personal relationships become alternative centers of public authority. The institution relies on one recognized source of legitimacy, the sovereign and the working family acting on behalf of the crown. Harry and Meghan occupy a different space. They are outside official royal service, but remain globally recognized through their titles, family connections, and continuing ability to speak about palace life. That creates an unusual imbalance. They can benefit from royal association without being bound by the full discipline expected of working royals. They can offer personal interpretations without representing the institution formally. The palace, meanwhile, must respond cautiously because every denial risks extending the controversy. In communications terms, the Sussexes can move quickly while the monarchy is forced to move slowly. Reports of private reunion details, therefore, carried a consequence far greater than embarrassment. They appeared to demonstrate that access itself could produce a fresh cycle of relevance, whether or not the Sussexes had personally authorized every claim. Royal commentators could debate the atmosphere, media outlets could reconstruct the encounter, and audiences could once again view the monarchy through the unresolved conflict between two brothers. The strongest shift, however, was not taking place in the headlines. It was taking place in the calculation surrounding the next decision. Charles now faced the possibility that refusing further contact might deepen the family divide, while allowing it could intensify doubts about control. William faced the prospect that his caution would be criticized publicly even if later events proved it justified. And the palace faced a question it could no longer avoid. Could any future reunion remain genuinely private once its symbolic value had become so profitable? Because the final meaning of the story does not depend only on who disclosed which detail. It depends on whether the monarchy has entered a new arrangement in which the Sussexes can regain royal relevance without accepting royal restraint, and whether Charles has opened a door that William may one day feel compelled to close. That possibility places the story within a much larger struggle over what royal belonging now means. In earlier generations, membership in the House of Windsor came with a rigid exchange. Privilege was granted alongside duty, visibility alongside restraint, and proximity to the sovereign alongside an expectation of silence. Harry and Meghan occupy a position that the traditional system was never designed to manage. They remain members of the king's family, retain globally recognized titles, and command extraordinary public attention, yet they operate beyond the daily authority of the palace. The reunion therefore revealed a structural weakness rather than merely another family disagreement. The monarchy can regulate those who formally serve it, but it has far less influence over relatives who retain royal identity while pursuing independent media, commercial, and pursuing independent media, charitable lives. Charles can decide whether to open a private door, but he cannot determine how the meaning of that access will evolve once it enters public conversation. The institution may control ceremony, but it no longer controls every interpretation of royalty. That difference will matter increasingly as the crown moves toward its next generation. William's future monarchy is expected to be smaller, more disciplined, and more focused on a limited number of working figures. Such a model depends upon clarity. The public must understand who speaks for the crown, who represents it officially, and who is acting only as a private individual. Every highly publicized Sussex reunion complicates that distinction because it reconnects two independent celebrities to the emotional center of the royal story. For Harry, the problem is equally difficult. His title continues to provide a significance no ordinary public career could easily replace. Invictus gives him genuine purpose and an international platform, but much of the attention surrounding him still comes from his relationship with the monarchy. When he returns to Britain, meets his father, or speaks about royal life, interest rises immediately. The closer he moves toward the family, however, the more questions return about duty, loyalty, and confidentiality. Meghan faces a similar contradiction from a different direction. Her post-royal identity was built around independence, self-determination, and freedom from palace control. Yet royal association remains central to the way the world interprets her. A private meeting with the king can renew cultural relevance without requiring a formal return to service. That does not prove the visit was commercially motivated, but it explains why even the appearance of renewed acceptance carries enormous value. The monarchy must now decide whether that value can be shared without weakening its own authority. Charles may regard family access as something that should never be treated as a reward or punishment. William may view it as a privilege that becomes dangerous when separated from accountability. Neither position is entirely without humanity, and neither is entirely free from risk. The difference is that Charles is making decisions under the pressure of time, while his heir is thinking about a reign that may have to manage the consequences for decades. This is where legacy enters the story. The king has often presented himself as a figure of reconciliation, faith, duty, and social understanding. A permanent break with his younger son could sit uneasily beside that image, particularly if grandchildren remain separated from the wider family. Yet a reconciliation followed by renewed public disclosures could damage another part of his legacy, the belief that he protected the dignity and stability of the crown during a vulnerable transition. William's legacy is already being shaped as well, long before he becomes sovereign. If he maintains distance, some may portray him as unforgiving. If he accepts renewed contact too quickly, others may question whether he has learned anything from earlier disclosures. The future king must therefore navigate an impossible public test in which restraint can appear cruel and openness can appear naive. His eventual approach to Harry may reveal much about the kind of monarchy he intends to lead. Public perception will be decisive because royal authority no longer depends only on constitutional position. It also depends on credibility. The family must be seen as capable of managing its own boundaries, protecting private relationships, and placing service above personal drama. When commentators begin mocking the palace for being outmaneuvered by selective reporting, the damage is not simply embarrassment. It creates an image of an institution reacting to events rather than directing them. Yet the Sussexes also face a credibility test. Their argument for privacy becomes harder to sustain if favorable details consistently emerge around private encounters. Their criticism of palace briefing culture loses force if the public suspects similar methods are being used on their behalf. Even where those suspicions are unproven, patterns of selective information can shape trust. A reputation is not formed only by what can be demonstrated in court or confirmed by officials. It is also formed by what audiences repeatedly believe they are witnessing. The next phase will therefore be measured less by statements than by behavior. Will the reunion be followed by another visit conducted with the same restraint? Will stories about emotional conversations continue to emerge? Will future interviews avoid using royal contact as evidence of status or reconciliation? And will the palace establish clearer boundaries before another private encounter creates another public contest over meaning? If silence follows, Charles may argue that compassion and caution can coexist. William may still remain guarded, but the king's decision could begin to look less like surrender and more like a controlled experiment in rebuilding trust. If further details appear, however, the reunion may be remembered as the moment the palace confirmed its own vulnerability, a private gesture transformed almost immediately into international narrative. That is why this story matters beyond one visit, one alleged leak, or one wave of mockery. It reveals a monarchy caught between the emotional obligations of family and the institutional demands of succession. Charles may still hope to recover a son without reopening a royal role, William may believe the two can no longer be separated. Harry and Meghan may insist they can remain independent while preserving meaningful family ties. The coming months may reveal whether those positions can coexist or whether one of them must eventually give way. And while this reunion may appear to settle the question of whether the royal door remains open, it leaves a more difficult question unresolved. Who will control what passes through that door next? The answer could shape not only Charles's relationship with his son, but William's future approach to the entire Sussex problem. Because as this chapter moves from private tension into royal precedent, another development elsewhere in the House of Windsor is already exposing how fragile the balance around the crown has become.